Hey guys, it's Jess with Jess Makes a Mess on Etsy, and today I'm going to teach you how to make this infinity scarf using fabric and a tube knit material. I worked up this tube knit on my Addi, and I'm not going to give a tutorial on how to do a tube knit on an Addi because there's 900 of those tutorials floating around on YouTube. Now, basically all you're doing is just making a tube. 220 rows using a worsted weight material. So I am going to take two different colors because one skein doesn't get you fully where you need to be, but just whip up your tube, 220 rows, and then come back to continue the video. Alright, so now we're at the cutting table. I have my fabric here. This is a fat quarter that I purchased at Martin's, and you'll see that the doubled width is 11 inches, so it's a 22-inch wide panel, and it is 18 inches in length. I have already completed my knitted tube, which is this here. This color is called The Struggle is Teal. It's sold by Hobby Lobby. It's the I Love This Yarn kind. And this is also I Love This Yarn in a solid. And that one is called just Ivory. I Love This Yarn. So I did 220 rows, and because this variegated yarn was not able to make it the full 220 rows, I figured, you know what, a coordinating solid would be perfect. So one of the things that we need to make sure that we do, we need to find the resting width of this tube. So I'm going to line it up on my thing here. I don't want to pull it in length, and I don't want to stretch it in width. I want to know what the resting width of this is. So when this is not being pulled in any direction, what is the actual width of these stitches? And we are at about 7.5 inches. So we want to make sure that when we cut our fabric, okay, we are going to have our fold right here. We're going to go 7.5 inches plus a 1/4 inch for seam allowance. So this doubled piece of fabric will make up our fabric portion of our scarf. So I have cut this fabric now. It is 7.5 inches wide plus my 1/4 inch, so it's 7 3/4 inches. I have the right sides together now, and I'm going to take this over to my machine, and I'm going to sew from this corner here about halfway up, leave myself a gap, and then sew the rest of this long side. So I want to leave myself a flipping hole. That way when my entire project is together, I have a way to flip it right side out. So I want to leave a gap here. So I'm going to go over to my machine and do some segment stitching. I stitched my segments in black so that you could see them in the video. I left my opening here for flipping, and I've inserted my tube into my tube of fabric. So now if you look up here, we have my raw edge that is not casted off, and we have the raw edge of my fabric. Now I want to make sure that these stitches, because they want to roll, are on the outside. Your knitted tube can be a little bit out, and then we want to make sure that it's evenly distributed all the way around. We don't want any bunching anywhere, so you kind of want to pull everything, make sure that the stitches are kind of laying nice and flat inside there, and then we want to go ahead and start pinning it all the way around. Want to make sure that the stitches don't move. You don't want any spots where it's really dense and then other spots where it's stretched, so you want to give it a good pinning. There we go, we're pinned all the way around. The knit and the fabric are pretty evenly distributed with each other. Now you'll see that I have couple of rows that are popped out here, and I want to do that on purpose because I don't want any of these loops being missed by the sewing machine when I'm sewing. So I'm going to actually pop this on my sewing machine as if it's a sleeve, and I'll show you how that's done too. When you get to your machine, you're going to want to pop this sucker off. Okay, that allows you to work a sleeve, so you have this space underneath here, so you can put tubes on your machine like this. Now, I want to set my needle pretty wide, so I'm going to go over to my settings. The other direction is where I want to go for it to move. It's moved all the way over this way, and I want a pretty long, whoops, this one right here. I want a pretty long stitch. I'm going to set it to 4. Okay, so I'm going to get it in there. And you need to be a little careful because those stitches want to catch on this little piton thing here. So I'm going to stitch all the way around the cuff of this fabric where it meets the knit, and kind of keep my presser foot edge right up against the edge of the fabric. These loops that are here are going to be sacrificed, so don't worry about these. Just try to keep them from catching onto your presser foot, and be very cautious of your pins at the same time. There we go. That looks pretty nice. So if you have access to a serger, running the serger along the edge of this fabric and chopping off these loops and kind of serging them through makes for a nice clean and not bumpy edge inside of your scarf here. But what you could do now, if you do not have access to a serger, is go ahead and trim all of this bulk off. That'll make it so that you can kind of eliminate some of this junk here. And you'll see on the inside your stitches have gone through the majority. They should have gone through everything. All the loops are pretty well locked now. I'd be very surprised if you have anything that would unravel after stitching, as long as you didn't get any hiccups along the way. So I'm going to take this over to my serger and clean this edge up. See how nice and clean that makes it. There's no loops popping out. My serger has 2 different colors on it, so it kind of looks ugly, but it is going to all be hidden and all of those extra loops totally eliminated. Now what we're going to do is we're going to pull this down and get it to meet this other edge. So I've pinned the opposite end. I've shimmied it through itself, started kind of pulling it out. I tried to leave everything as flat as possible. If you twist anything while you're shimmying it down, you'll end up with a twist in your scarf. Now my first one had that, and it was actually really cute. My second one didn't have that, but that would be how you would achieve it if you wanted it, and how you'd avoid it if you didn't want it. So now I'm ready to bring this to my machine and do the exact same thing to this side. Alright, so the second side is all stitched and then serged. You'll notice that I ran over my tail thread, which really doesn't matter because this is the inside, so it's just all going to be hidden anyway. Now, I left this gap here, remember? Now we're going to pull everything out of it and flip it right side out. It joined together beautifully. So I took it over to the ironing board. My little opening is over here, but I made sure I pressed everything nice and flat. I'm going to go to the machine again, and I'm going to sew along the edge here, and I'm going to sew along the edge here, which will close up this hole here. I'm going to make sure that my seam allowance here is going to be really narrow so that it is sure to catch all of this here without there being a hole. So now one of the things that I wanted to mention is, you see how nicely it transitions from the woven to the knit, and how I don't have a big sucking in over here. Now that's because I measured this before I cut this. If you wanted to mass produce these, you really do need to measure these before you cut your fabric, because each and every single yarn that you use will kind of rest differently. Some of them will want to be a little bit tighter, some of them will want to be a little bit looser. Your measurement may not be the same as mine, so you want to make sure that you knit your tube first and then measure that. Then you can take your measurement and cut your fabric. If you hold your yarn tighter, your tube would be tighter, possibly looser, depending on what it is that you're using and how your technique is. So you want to make sure you do this first, then cut your fabric. Alrighty, so I did stitch both sides. You'll probably notice that you have a really hard time going all the way to the edge, so I really just stitched to where the bulk stops, and I do back stitching at either end. Now there's a couple reasons why we do this top stitching. The first reason, obviously, to close up that gap that we left. The second is so that none of this kind of shifts. We don't want the material to kind of do this while we're wearing it. Same thing goes with the knit. We don't want the knit to kind of roll or rotate at all. So when I sew on my buttons, I go through all the layers. So you'll see this tiny little dimple, but that is actually because we want the knit not to kind of shift on itself. So this is all nicely done. It looks pretty nice. So give me a second and I'll put it on. Don't mind my office because this is where I actually work, so my studio is a mess. But here we go. It looks really good, really nice. So we have two different tones here. You can always kind of switch up the way that you wear it to see which color is more on the outside. You could have put your buttons on the other color as well, or gone one color this entire way in your knitting. But it looks pretty cute. I really like these. And so far they've been a really big seller. So if this is something that you do, you make things and you sell them, especially during quarantine times, this is something that is very easily sold between $25 and $40. So not too bad of a project, and took about an hour. So anyway, I hope you have fun. See you next time. Hey guys, it's Jess with Jess Makes a Mess on Etsy, and today I'm going to teach you how to make this infinity scarf using fabric and a tube knit material. I worked up this tube knit on my Addi, and I'm not going to give a tutorial on how to do a tube knit on an Addi because there's 900 of those tutorials floating around on YouTube. Now, basically all you're doing is just making a tube. 220 rows using a worsted weight material. So I am going to take two different colors because one skein doesn't get you fully where you need to be, but just whip up your tube, 220 rows, and then come back to continue the video.